Okay, I'm just going to do another essay question on the lieutenant. This question it has a quote with it, and the quote is here, but a man could not travel along two different paths. And then the main part of the question is, does the novel suggest that duty and conscience can never coexist? Now, I really want to draw your attention to an excellent video that Lisa Tran, part of Lisa's, the owner of Lisa Study Guides, has put up on a really similar question and this same quote. So I would watch my video and her video if you want to kind of see two different ways of going about it. But I highly recommend it. It's fantastic. Okay, so this question, first thing is that you've got to recognise that when you get a quote, that is not the question that you're meant to be discussing. The question you're meant to be discussing is this one. Does the novel suggest that duty and conscience can never coexist? So you must focus your discussion on answering and resolving that part of the question. That doesn't mean that you can ignore the quote, and in fact you shouldn't ignore the quote at all. The quote is really important, and you need to have a think about how that quote and what's going on when that quote occurs in the novel, how that can inform and help you to think about this idea here. So what happens if you have a question and you see the quote and you don't know where the quote comes from in the text? Well, in my view, you should look at the other question, and if you can answer that one, you should answer the other question, because if you don't use the quote at all or refer to it at all, then I don't feel that you have really fully dealt with the question in the way that the question's intended to be dealt with. That said, I don't think you'll fail the question either. It just means that the best students are going to be able to use that quote in their answers and do a good job with it. If you've got a pretty good idea of where it came from in the text, but you don't remember exactly, you probably can get away with just using it and talking about the general idea that's embodied within it. I mean, I think most of us could guess that we're talking here about Rook. We're talking about towards the end of the text when he can either continue his relationship with Tagaran or he can stick with his duty to the British Empire, and it's going to be hard for him to do both. Even if you don't remember the exact situation, you can probably wing it a little bit and discuss that general thing that's going on in the text and some of the things that occur, even if you can't actually remember when it occurs. All right, but far better to know, and it's also really important that you don't make a mistake and use the quote in a way that is inaccurate. So if you use this quote to discuss something that happened in part one where he thought maybe he could be an astronomer or he could go into the military, you would be using the quote really incorrectly there, and I think that would be to your detriment. So do your best to know what the quote is when you're using it, and if you don't know, really strongly consider looking at the other question. Okay, as it happens, this quote comes from it's around page 218, and it comes from that scene where Tagaran comes to Rook and asks him to intervene and to help him to defend her friend Tuyia, who has been attacked by a white man. And he realizes that he can't help her, and he says, no, it's impossible. It's not possible for him to help at all. And this helps Rook to realize that he's been living in a bit of a fantasy world. And here's the quote in full. He had been pretending that it was not so. And this word here, pretending, is important. Here, a world existed here in this hut, a world he shared with Tagaran and the others. It was on another orbit altogether from the one that he shared with his own kind. But a man could not travel along two different paths. Tagaran knew that. Now he knew it too. So it's about a moment of realization where he's been living in this bubble with Tagaran and really loving what he's doing, and it all comes to a head, and he realizes that he must take one path or the other, and he cannot continue with both at the same time. Okay, so let's have another look at some of the other words in the question, and we want to think about the question here has a question mark at the end of it, and also this word at the start, and also the word never in here. So this is asking us something quite specific. Does the novel suggest, so is it one of the messages of the novel, that duty and conscience can never coexist? So never means not ever, under any circumstances. And coexist, what does that mean? Well, coexist means to be there at the same time. So you can have one thing there and one thing there, and if they are at the same time, they are coexisting. People can coexist with each other even when they hate each other or under terrible circumstances. And so I think one of the things that you could do when you think about this question is you can look at the ways that duty and conscience possibly can coexist, but that there's a tension between them, and look at the ways that they can be existing at the same time. Rook can have a conscience. He does have a conscience at all times, I think. And he also obeys his duty. But what does it do to him when he doesn't follow his conscience? The effects of that. So I think the novel, for me anyway, the novel certainly doesn't suggest that duty and conscience can never coexist. In fact, they coexist continually for the main character Rook, and for other characters such as Gardner, and for Silk as well. But they are often impossible to reconcile in an easy, harmonious kind of way. There's this tension between duty and conscience through most of the text. And that is because the duty that we're mostly talking about, duty here, it doesn't say military duty, it doesn't say duty to the British Empire, but that's what our minds automatically go to. But duty, people can have duties to all sorts of different things. And sometimes you have a duty to follow your conscience. You have a duty to stand by your beliefs. You have a duty to your family, to your friends, to yourself sometimes. But in this text, the military duty that Rook and others are forced to follow and uphold is often at odds with their moral views on the world. And so what we're talking about here is the military duty is taking precedence over other duties. So military duty, and then there are other duties as well. So particularly duty to conscience or duty to morals, other duties, so family, friends, morals, being true to yourself, those kinds of things. And really, they're being the soldiers are being asked to suppress various duties to other things that they might feel, and to put forward always the duty of empire. So I think that the way I decided to go about answering the question is I'll just move down now to my paragraph points. You know, one of the I tend to like to write my first paragraph, a paragraph that gives us an orientation to the world of the text, and in particular to British society, the British military machine, the way that Rook is implicated in this system. He has very little agency, autonomy, or power, and so forth. I like to set that up in my opening paragraph. I then why? I then like to use my second paragraph to look at the complications within the text. So the way that this becomes complicated, and I use that model of orientation, complication, and resolution to look at the middle sections of the text as Rook starts to forge relationships with the Cadigal people, and the tension really starts to ramp up between his military obligations and the new relationships, friendships, and ways of seeing the world that develop through those relationships. And then the stay. Stay. All right, and then finally, I like to finish with the way that Grenville resolves the text in terms of resolution, in terms of Rook's moral stance and his the way that he takes a moral stance and a brave stance to stand up against injustice. Now, obviously not, you're going to need to adapt to other questions, but this works a lot of the time for many questions. Okay, hopefully that'll stay still. Okay, let's have a look at what I wrote. These are my topic sentences where what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture my idea on the question in a single sentence if possible. Occasionally I have to go to two if it's too, the idea is a little bit difficult to capture easily in one sentence. So Grenville emphasises the way the British military machine relies upon fear to ensure obedience to duty and disallows independent actions determined by conscience. Okay, so I'm going to probably in my next sentence say something about how this it is not that duty and conscience cannot coexist, but the circumstances of their coexistence mean that the obedience to duty is always put first, and conscience has to take a back seat. I'm going to try to avoid using that more flowery language in my analytical writing as well. So I'm going to be talking about using that part one heavily, use the discussion of the nature of British society and the military, most of which comes out of that whole that whole hanging incident mainly. I might bring in some of the stuff on slavery as well, and not maybe focus too much on that, but certainly the Rook's comments about his disquiet that he feels about people being treated as if they're animals and traded and so forth. I might bring that in there too. I would certainly talk about the battle, but again, not make too much out of it because it's not really about conscience. It's more about duty and about the fact that duty, to the extent of duty, means that you've got to stand there and be shot at. It's not really about conscience, so I wouldn't overuse that. The main example is the hanging one here, I think. And I would probably also extend my discussion just with a short reference to the parade ground scene in New South Wales, where he is implicated in that military machine there as well, where they're having to guard convicts and so forth. But I probably would just reference that there in a sentence or so before moving on to my next paragraph. So my next paragraph is that military duty and conscience are also shown in a state of coexistence as officers in New South Wales struggle to find ways to strike a balance between the two. So this one is going to be, I'm saying they coexist, but talking about tensions between them and a struggle to balance them. And here I'm going to get this quote, the two paths quote's going to come in here, and eventually get to that idea that Rook cannot hide away. And he eventually finds that he's got to choose one side or the other, and at first actually he chooses duty over conscience. So I'll probably be mentioning that Rook is trying to avoid implication on this by getting out of the way up in his observatory, but Gardner's experiences show how reality is going to intrude upon this. It kind of foreshadows what's going to happen to Rook himself. I'll discuss briefly Rook's the private joy that he experiences through his relationship with Tagaran, but how this becomes more and more difficult by some of the developments that are happening in the society, particularly when she wants him to show her the gun, when she asks him about uh, uh, 2-year, to help with 2-year, and I would use that quote then. But I'd probably also bring in, as a major example, that flogging where he's forced to wear the red coat there and watch that flogging. So all of that stuff I would develop in that third paragraph. And then finally, in my last paragraph, I have: ultimately, Grenville suggests that duty and conscience can only be reconciled when Rook shifts his allegiance from duty to empire to duty to humanitarian ideals. So here I'm going to bring in Silk and the way that he too shares disquiet about the idea of the punitive expedition and the cutting off the heads. But his solution to this is to try to avoid doing the actions, much as Rook was avoiding himself there. But Rook breaks with that idea of avoidance, and he starts to act directly. And he actually breaks with his duty to the empire, and he starts to uphold a different duty, a duty to his friends, to what he sees as morally right, to the fact that if you're not acting to change something, you are on some level party to it, and that idea that he cannot keep his hands clean by just avoiding things, and he must do more than what he has been. And so I'll use that escalating disobedience that he has of his duties, and then finish with his lifelong duty to humanitarian action for slaves, and that he dies at peace with duty and conscience. And that is how I'm going to write my essay. All right, thanks guys. Like and subscribe.